Hello, my name is Dr. Jackie Hinckley, and I'm Executive Director of Voices of Hope for Aphasia. We are proud to be collaborating with the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg on a really exciting project. Our project is called Building Research Initiatives by Developing Group Effort, Project Bridge. And we're going to be providing webinars for people with aphasia, their families, and researchers, leading up to a very exciting conference in October of 2018. So this is the first of 3 webinars designed for people with aphasia and their families. And we're going to start by talking about what is research and how can you get involved. At the end of this webinar, you will be able to identify at least 3 of the steps of research, know the meaning of collaborative research, discuss different ways for consumers and researchers to collaborate, and list at least 2 questions you could ask a researcher. Let's get started. What is research? Well, it just simply means asking a question and finding an answer. But it's not guessing about the answer or not just formulating an opinion. Research usually refers to a method that leads us to an answer that we can be confident of. This is a graphic that shows the basic steps in the classical scientific method. As you can see, the very first step is to ask a question. There's all kinds of questions that we can ask and try to answer by research. For example, we might be wondering, how does the brain change after stroke and aphasia? What is the most helpful aphasia test? And what is the best way to help recover language after stroke? All 3 of these are examples of possible research questions. Once we have a question, though, we have to go through a whole process. First, we figure out what is a possible answer or a hypothesis that answers the question. Then we conduct an experiment that will help us answer it. We analyze the results, and finally, we make a conclusion. When we come up with a conclusion that's based on research, let's take an example. Let's say we found out something important about intensive aphasia therapy. That conclusion has implications. That means that once we know something and we're confident of it based on research, there might need to be more intensive therapy programs or other things that would be implications. And so research conclusions affect you as a person with aphasia and a family member. Research conclusions might affect how frequently a program or a treatment is available, where it's offered, how competently or widespread it is practiced by therapists, and ultimately it might actually contribute to which treatments or programs are funded by insurance. So, research is very important to you and your life with aphasia. And we're hoping you're going to be interested in expressing and contributing your voice to the research process. Let's go back to that first step, asking questions. Who asks these questions? How does the research get started in the first place? Well, there are people with aphasia and their families, therapists or doctors, and researchers, and we have these three different groups. A lot of research is started by researchers asking a question. They may have input from therapists or doctors or people with aphasia to various degrees, or perhaps not. Collaborative research means when we deliberately and explicitly get the different groups together and combine our views and understand each other a bit better, and the research grows from there. Here's an example that's already occurred. In this example, people with aphasia and their families and doctors and therapists got together. They had meetings, they discussed research priorities, and the conclusion was the top 10 research priorities for living with stroke. And I want to show you the results of that collaborative research. They came up with top 10 research priorities about living with stroke, and this was published in the International Journal of Stroke. Number 10, starting from the bottom, is: are exercise and fitness programs beneficial at improving function and quality of life and avoiding subsequent stroke? Number 9, what is the best way to improve confidence after stroke? Number 8, how can stroke survivors and families be helped to cope with speech problems? Number 7, what are the best treatments to improve balance, gait, and mobility? Number 6, what are the best ways to manage or prevent fatigue? Are any of these questions important to you? Let's see what the top 5 research priorities that those groups came up with. Number 5, what are the best ways to treat visual problems after stroke? Number 4, what are the best treatments for arm recovery and function? Number 3, what are the best ways to help people recover from aphasia? Number 2, what are the best ways of helping people come to terms with the long-term consequences of stroke? And the number 1 research priority about living with stroke that these groups came up with collaboratively was: what are the best ways to improve understanding, your thinking skills or cognition after stroke? You see that asking about aphasia is one of the top 3 research priorities. Well, that's just an example of what happens when different groups collaborate. We can come up with important research questions that will drive important research conclusions. Here's an example of how researchers and people with aphasia and families can collaborate. There are different levels of collaboration. In fact, we're going to use 5 different levels of collaboration. And let's talk about each of these a little bit. So the first thing that can happen is a researcher comes up with a question and a study and asks you, a person with aphasia or a family member, to be a participant in a research. How many of you have volunteered to participate in a research study? But there's more to it. You can contribute more to research than just being a participant. So the next level of collaboration might be for people with aphasia and their families to serve as advisory board members, to give your expert opinion about whether things are aphasia friendly, for example. Level 3 is you might occasionally review information or consult with the researchers about the best ways to interact with people with aphasia, or maybe the best ways to explain information to people with aphasia. You might have an ongoing relationship with the researcher, so every time the researcher needs some input, you are an ongoing advisor. These are all different ways to collaborate with researchers. Perhaps one of the highest levels of collaborative research is when you are a co-researcher with a scientist. Well, what does that mean? I'm going to give you 2 examples of projects in which people with aphasia were co-researchers. Here's the first example. In this example, researchers and a person with aphasia wrote about the whole process of getting a person with aphasia back to work. The researchers described the person's case from a clinical point of view, but the person with aphasia talked about it and wrote about it from his point of view. He wrote about what helped and what was hard, and the researchers helped to write this up. Together, the researchers and the person with aphasia published a paper in a journal called Aphasiology, and the person with aphasia chose to use his initials, GD, in the publication, but he was still included as one of the authors of this research publication. Here's a second example. In this example, a researcher and a person with aphasia met for several meetings, and the researcher listens to the person with aphasia tell her story. After every meeting, the researcher wrote up notes about the meeting. She also wrote about her own reactions to what the person with aphasia was saying and writes it all up in one document. Then together, the researcher and the person with aphasia read what's written up, talk about everything the researcher wrote, and they can disagree and they can change things, and the person with aphasia has an equal view or voice about what's in the document. If they agree that's a story to publish, and in this example, the person with aphasia wanted her name to be used in the story, but she didn't want to be listed as an author. So even though you don't see the persons with aphasia's name in the list of authors, her name is in the story when you go to read it. And that was her choice. The person with aphasia chose how she wanted her name to be shown. So those are just two examples of people with aphasia and researchers collaborating at the highest level as co-researchers. What would happen if we all contributed to coming up with research questions? If we got everybody's point of view? Well, many people from other fields feel that we would end up with some of the most important, meaningful research because it would represent everybody's point of view. Would you like to help with research, even more than just participating in research? The first place to start is to know some questions or ways you can effectively have a conversation with a researcher. It might be sometimes kind of intimidating to sit down with a researcher because you might feel like you don't know where to start. So I'm going to give you a few questions you can ask a researcher and start the conversation. Here's one. You can ask the researcher, what is the question you want to answer? Now that you know the steps of research, you know that that's the first and most important part of research, is posing the question. So say, what's the question you're working on? Help me understand it. Any researcher would probably be happy to get a question like that from you. Here's another question. Ask the researcher, what are your possible answers you're going to get? There's always more than one answer. So I'd like to know what are possibilities that are going to come out of this research? How will you get the answer? It might be interesting to know how the researcher is going to design the steps of the experiment to try to come up with a solid answer. So, as an example, let's say a researcher is working on a project with the title Aerobic Exercise and Aphasia Treatment. You could ask the researcher, what's the question you want to answer? Help me understand it. And the researcher might say something like, well, I want to know, does aerobic exercise make aphasia treatment work better? Then you could say, well, what are the possible answers to that question? The researcher might talk to you about how exercise might help, or maybe exercise doesn't make any difference. It's also possible exercise makes it worse. Maybe the person's too tired. So there are lots of possible answers. Then you could ask the researcher, how will you get the answer? And the researcher could maybe explain how they're going to compare aphasia treatment with exercise to aphasia treatment without exercise, or something similar to that. So now, at the beginning of this webinar, we said you'd be able to do a few things now that we've gotten to the end. The first thing we said is you'd be able to identify at least 3 of the 5 steps of research. Remember, the first step is to ask a question. Then we make a guess and we conduct an experiment and analyze, and it leads us to a conclusion. The second thing that we learned in this webinar is the meaning of collaborative research. It means people with aphasia and their families, researchers and clinicians all coming together and expressing their views and making a contribution. The third thing we learned in this webinar is to discuss different ways for consumers and researchers to collaborate. We learned that there were at least 5 different levels for consumers and researchers to collaborate, starting with the person with aphasia as a participant in a study designed by a researcher, moving up to people with aphasia and their families, serving as advisors and consultants to the research to make the research better for people with aphasia, all the way up to the idea of people with aphasia being co-researchers with a researcher. And we gave a couple of examples of that. Finally, we wanted you to be able to know at least 2 questions that you could ask a researcher. Remember that you can say things like, what's the question you want to answer? What are the possible answers to that question? These are not silly questions. These are great questions to start a conversation with the researcher. In October of 2018, we'll be holding a conference for people with aphasia, their families, and researchers to come together to express their opinions and start to form teams that can work together to conduct collaborative research. We hope that as somebody who's watched our webinars, you'll be joining us there too. To get more details about it, go to our webpage at the National Aphasia Association. It's aphasia.org/research-bridge. Thanks for watching, and make sure and watch the second webinar in this series too.